I never imagined a birthday invitation could feel like a warning. When the message arrived, it was polite, warm even, yet something about it made my chest tighten. Maybe it was the sender's name. Maybe it was the sudden friendliness after years of distance. Or maybe it was instinct, the kind that whispers before disaster. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. It was just a birthday party. Families fight, families forgive. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The house looked unreal when I arrived. Lights glowed softly against the evening sky, expensive cars lined the driveway, and laughter floated through open doors like nothing in the world could be wrong. The moment I stepped inside, familiar faces turned toward me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Hugs were exchanged, compliments were given. Everything felt rehearsed, like everyone knew their lines except me. Music played low in the background, glasses clinked, the smell of cake and perfume mixed in the air. For a brief moment, I relaxed. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this night would pass quietly. I stood near the wall, observing, noticing how conversations stopped when I walked too close, how whispers resumed the second I turned away. Old habits never really die in families like ours. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the birthday gifts. One by one, wrapped boxes were presented with exaggerated enthusiasm. Applause followed each one. Smiles widened for the crowd. When my turn came, I handed over a simple gift. Nothing flashy, just something thoughtful. The reaction was polite, restrained. A quick thank you, a nod. The attention moved on, and I felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. That's when the comment came. It was subtle, almost playful, disguised as a joke. Something about effort and knowing your place. Laughter erupted from a few corners of the room. Others froze. My ears burned. I looked around, hoping someone would change the subject, but no one did. The silence that followed felt heavier than the insult itself. I don't know why I spoke. Maybe it was the years of swallowing words. Maybe it was the unfairness of being humiliated publicly. Or maybe I was simply tired. My response wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Just one sentence. Calm, clear. And the moment it left my mouth, the entire room went still. You could hear the music playing, awkwardly cheerful, completely out of place. Someone dropped a fork, eyes widened, faces stiffened. The birthday smile disappeared, replaced by something colder. I realized too late that I had crossed an invisible line, one that wasn't about respect, but about power. They didn't shout, they didn't argue. They leaned in and lowered their voice, close enough for only me to hear. The words were quiet, controlled, and far more frightening than anger. "Be careful," they said. "This can go much further than you think." In that moment, surrounded by cake and candles, I felt something shift. This was no longer a family disagreement. This was something else entirely. Something with consequences I couldn't yet see, but would soon understand. I tried to brush it off at first. I told myself it was just intimidation, an empty warning meant to scare me back into silence. I stood there pretending to be calm, nodding as if I understood, while my heart beat so loudly I was sure others could hear it. Around us, the party tried to restart. Laughter returned in small, forced bursts. Someone turned the music up slightly, as if volume alone could erase what had just happened. But the air had changed. I could feel it in the way people avoided my eyes, in the way conversations shifted whenever I approached. I suddenly wasn't a guest anymore. I was a problem, a risk, something uncomfortable that no one wanted near their carefully curated evening. A few minutes later, someone pulled me aside, a relative, smiling too much, voice too soft. They told me I should apologize. Not because I was wrong, they said, but because it would be better for everyone. Better for the family name, better for peace, better for the future. The word future lingered in my mind, heavy and unclear. I asked what they meant. Their smile tightened. "You don't want things to get legal," they replied. That was the second time the word appeared that night. Legal. It didn't belong in a room full of balloons and birthday candles, yet there it was, sitting between us like an uninvited guest. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This was no longer about hurt feelings. This was about control. I looked across the room and saw the birthday persons surrounded by supporters, laughing again, perfectly composed. The performance was back on. Anyone watching from the outside would think the night was flawless. I wondered how many of them knew what was happening beneath the surface, and how many simply didn't care as long as it wasn't happening to them. I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, quiet, a sharp contrast to the noise inside. For the first time since arriving, I could breathe. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message, then another. Short, direct. Words like defamation, reputation, and consequences stared back at me from the screen. Each message felt colder than the last. My hands shook as I read them. I replayed every sentence over in my head, searching for anything that could justify such threats. It hadn't been a lie, it hadn't been cruel, it had simply been true. And that, I realized, was the real problem. When I went back inside, the cake was being cut. Everyone gathered close, smiling for photos. I stood at the edge of the room, invisible now. No one invited me forward, no one asked if I was okay. The candles were blown out to applause, and I felt something else disappear with them, any illusion that this night was about celebration. Someone brushed past me and whispered, "You should leave before this gets worse." I didn't argue. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard my name one last time. Not shouted, not angry. Calm, calculated. A reminder that lawyers were already involved, that words had consequences, that I had made a mistake. I stepped outside without responding. The door closed behind me, muffling the music, the laughter, the birthday wishes. Standing alone under the dim lights, I realized something with painful clarity. The party was over, but whatever I had just stepped into was only beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the scene replayed itself. The silence, the stares, the calm voice warning me to be careful. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message, something official, something final. Morning came without relief. The fear didn't fade with daylight. If anything, it grew sharper. By noon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a family member. The message was formal, carefully worded, and unmistakably serious. It didn't say lawsuit outright, but it didn't need to. It talked about false statements, damage to reputation, and possible legal action if the matter escalated. I read it 3 times, my throat tightening with every word. A birthday party had somehow turned into this. I tried to remember every detail, every word I had spoken. Had anyone recorded me? Had someone twisted my sentence into something else? In families like ours, truth was flexible, bent to fit whoever held the most power, and I didn't hold much. Calls started coming in after that. Some were sympathetic, whispered reassurances that I'd done nothing wrong. Others were warnings disguised as concern. They told me to apologize quickly, quietly, before things went too far. One person even suggested I write a public message admitting I had been emotional and mistaken, not because it was true, but because it would protect everyone else. That's when the anger finally surfaced. Not loud, not explosive, but steady and burning. I realized they weren't afraid of legal trouble. They were afraid of exposure, afraid that someone had finally said out loud what had been hidden behind smiles and money for years. I decided to speak to someone outside the family, a professional, someone who wouldn't care about birthdays or reputations. The consultation was brief but sobering. I was told that threats like these were often meant to intimidate, to silence, that truth mattered, but so did evidence, witnesses, and power. I was advised to save everything, messages, call logs, screenshots, just in case. Hearing the words "just in case" made everything feel real. Later that evening, I received another message. This one was softer, almost kind. It said we could still fix this if I admitted fault and promised not to repeat what I'd said.
No court, no drama, just silence. The offer felt like a trap wrapped in peace. I stared at my screen for a long time. Apologizing would end the stress, the fear, the uncertainty, but it would also mean accepting that honesty was wrong, that speaking up deserved punishment. I thought about how easily they had turned a celebration into a threat, how quickly love had been replaced by leverage. I typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted it again. In the end, I said very little. I acknowledged their message. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I simply stated that I would not be discussing the matter further. The reply came quickly, cold, final. Any future communication, it said, should go through legal channels. That was the moment it truly hit me. This wasn't about a party or a sentence or even a family argument. It was about control, and I had slipped out of it. As I set my phone down, a strange calm settled in. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something stronger. Clarity. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back to how things were before that birthday. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was living someone else's life. Every notification made my heart jump. Every unknown number felt like the beginning of something irreversible. I carried my phone everywhere, even when I didn't need it, as if being ready would somehow make the situation easier to handle. Family gatherings stopped overnight. Group chats went silent. People who used to call me weekly suddenly became unreachable. It was as if I had been quietly erased. No dramatic announcements, no confrontations, just distance. And in that silence, the message was clear. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. A letter arrived a few days later, printed, formal, heavy in my hands. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet, but it was close enough to make my stomach drop. It repeated the same accusations in more official language, warning me to refrain from making false or damaging statements in the future. Reading it felt like being accused of a crime I didn't commit. I noticed something then that stayed with me. Nowhere in the letter did it actually say I was lying. It simply implied that the truth was inconvenient. I shared the letter with the professional I had consulted earlier. They confirmed what I already suspected. This was pressure, not justice, a strategy. The goal wasn't to win a case, it was to scare me into submission before anything ever reached a courtroom. That knowledge helped, but it didn't erase the emotional weight. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake, I replayed old memories, holidays, shared jokes, moments that once felt genuine. I wondered how many of them were real, and how many had only existed because I stayed quiet. Another message came late one evening, this time from the birthday person themselves. No threats, no legal language, just disappointment. They said I had embarrassed them, that I had ruined something important, that everything could have been avoided if I had known my place. Reading those words hurt more than any legal warning. For the first time, I typed back without hesitation. I didn't accuse, I didn't defend. I simply said that respect went both ways, and that silence had never protected me before. There was no reply. Weeks passed without escalation, no court papers, no official action. Slowly, I began to understand the pattern. The threats were real enough to frighten me, but not strong enough to stand on their own. They had relied on my fear, on my attachment to family, on my willingness to retreat. As that fear faded, something else grew in its place: strength. Distance gave me perspective. I saw how often love had been conditional, how acceptance depended on obedience. The birthday party hadn't created the problem, it had revealed it. One afternoon, I received an invitation to another family event. Different occasion, different host. The message was polite, almost identical to the one that had started everything. I stared at it for a long time before declining. No explanation, no apology. I realized then that walking away wasn't weakness. It was the first choice I'd made without fear guiding it. The birthday that ended in court threats had taken something from me: comfort, trust, innocence. But it had also given me something I didn't know I needed, the courage to choose myself. Life slowly settled into a strange new rhythm. On the surface, everything looked normal again. I went to work, met friends, laughed at the right moments, but underneath, something had shifted permanently. I was more careful with my words, more aware of how quickly things could turn when pride and power were involved. The birthday party lingered in my mind like a bruise you don't see but always feel. Occasionally, I would hear updates through indirect channels. Someone mentioned that the birthday person was still angry. Someone else said they felt betrayed. The narrative kept changing depending on who was telling it. In some versions, I was emotional. In others, jealous. In a few, dangerous. It amazed me how easily a single honest sentence could be reshaped into a threat. What hurt most wasn't the gossip. It was the realization that no one ever asked me what I meant. They didn't want understanding. They wanted alignment. Silence would have kept me safe, but it would have cost me something deeper, my sense of self. One evening, as I was scrolling through old photos on my phone, I found pictures from past birthdays, smiling faces, arms around shoulders. Moments that once felt warm now looked staged, like proof of a story I had told myself for too long. I wondered how many times I had laughed just to avoid tension, how many times I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. The legal threats never materialized into action. No court date, no official action. And that, strangely, confirmed everything. The fear was the weapon, not the law. Once I stopped reacting, the power of the threat faded. Still, there were consequences. Relationships changed. Invitations stopped. My name was no longer spoken with affection in certain rooms. But there was also relief. I didn't have to perform anymore. I didn't have to pretend that disrespect was love, or that silence was maturity. Months later, I ran into someone who had been at the party. We spoke awkwardly at first, then more openly. They admitted the night had made them uncomfortable too, that they had seen the shift, the control, the way the word court was used to end a conversation rather than resolve it. Hearing that mattered more than I expected. It reminded me that truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Looking back, I understand why that birthday ended the way it did. It wasn't about the cake, the gift, or even the comment. It was about a system that depended on everyone knowing their place and staying in it. The moment I spoke, I stepped outside that system, and systems don't like that. If I had stayed silent, the night would have ended with smiles and photos, but it would have cost me years more of swallowing discomfort. The threat of court was meant to scare me back in line. Instead, it pushed me forward, out of a space that had been shrinking me for a long time. I don't regret going to that party anymore. I regret only how long it took me to trust my instincts. The invitation felt like a warning, because it was one, not of what I would face, but of what I would finally see. That birthday didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in clarity. And sometimes that's far more life-changing than any legal battle. Time has a way of softening sharp memories, but it also sharpens understanding. As weeks turned into months, the shock faded, and what remained was a quiet awareness of how close I had come to losing myself just to keep others comfortable. The birthday party became a reference point in my mind, the moment before and the moment after. Everything seemed to divide itself that way. I noticed changes in myself first. I stopped explaining my choices to people who were determined to misunderstand them. I stopped chasing approval that had always been conditional. When conversations drifted toward family drama, I listened instead of defending. Silence, I learned, could be chosen freely too, not forced through fear. There were moments of doubt. Late nights when I wondered if one apology could have saved everything, if swallowing my pride might have preserved relationships that once mattered. But then I remembered how quickly affection had turned into intimidation, how celebration had become leverage. Love that disappears when challenged was never as solid as I had believed. One afternoon, I received a message I didn't expect. It was short and neutral, asking if we could clear the air. No mention of lawyers, no threats, just an attempt to reset the narrative. I read it carefully, noticing what wasn't there. No accountability, no acknowledgement of harm, just a desire to move on without addressing what had happened.
I didn't reply right away. I sat with the message, weighing peace against truth. Eventually, I realized I could have both, but only on my terms. I responded politely, setting boundaries, making it clear that respect was non-negotiable. The reply never came, and for the first time, that silence didn't bother me. I began to understand that the court threats had never been about justice. They were about reminding me of my position, about ensuring I wouldn't forget who had influence and who was expected to comply. Once I stopped reacting, the threat lost its power. Without fear, it was just words. Strangely, the experience also made me more empathetic. I saw how many people stayed quiet not because they agreed, but because they were afraid of losing access, support, or approval. I didn't blame them anymore. I had been one of them for years. When my next birthday came around, it was nothing like the last one I had attended. No grand venue, no performance, just a few people who knew the whole story and didn't need me to be anything other than honest. There was laughter that didn't feel forced, conversations that didn't carry hidden meanings. For the first time, celebration felt light. I realized then that endings don't always arrive loudly. Some come as quiet decisions, to step back, to say no, to stop shrinking yourself for spaces that don't deserve you. The birthday party that ended in court threats wasn't the end of my family story, but it was the end of a chapter where fear had too much control. I don't know if they ever truly believed they would take me to court. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. What matters is that the threat worked exactly once, until I refused to let it define me. And that refusal changed everything. Looking back now, I can see how carefully that night was constructed. Not just the party, but the roles everyone played. The host as the center of attention, the supporters as the echo, and me, as long as I stayed quiet, as background. The moment I spoke, the balance broke, and everyone rushed to fix it the only way they knew how. Pressure, fear, authority. What stayed with me most wasn't the threat itself, but how quickly it was accepted as normal. No one said it was too far. No one questioned whether mentioning court at a birthday party was excessive. It was treated like a reasonable response, a tool available to those who knew how to use it. That realization changed how I saw power, not as something loud, but as something casually exercised. I started noticing similar patterns elsewhere, in workplaces, in friendships, in conversations where one person's comfort mattered more than another's truth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and once you stop cooperating with it, things get uncomfortable, for everyone but you. Occasionally, someone would reach out with updates, trying to pull me back into the story. They'd say the situation had been misunderstood, or that emotions had simply run high. The word apology never appeared. Accountability remained absent. It became clear that what they missed wasn't me, it was my silence. There were moments of sadness. You don't walk away from shared history without feeling its weight. Birthdays, holidays, inside jokes, all of it doesn't disappear just because you choose distance. But I learned that grief doesn't always mean regret. Sometimes it's just the cost of choosing differently. One day, I ran into the birthday person unexpectedly. No audience, no supporters, just the two of us in a neutral space. We exchanged polite words, nothing more. There was no anger in the air, just distance. And in that distance, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: uncertainty. Without the room, the power, the backing, the threat of court, they were just another person, not untouchable, not in control. We parted without resolving anything, and that was okay. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from understanding you no longer need it. The story eventually lost its urgency among those who weren't directly involved.
New dramas replaced old ones, my name faded from discussion, and with that fading came freedom. I wasn't being watched anymore, judged, weighed. I was simply living. The birthday that ended in court threats taught me something no celebration ever had. It showed me the exact moment when politeness becomes self-betrayal, when staying quiet costs more than speaking up, and when fear disguises itself as responsibility. If someone asked me now whether I would do it differently, I know the answer. I wouldn't change the sentence. I wouldn't soften the truth. I wouldn't apologize for reacting to disrespect just to keep the peace, because peace built on silence isn't peace at all. That night took away the illusion of safety, but it gave me something far more valuable: clarity about who I am when pressure shows up uninvited. And that clarity stayed with me long after the cake was gone, the lights were turned off, and the threat of court became nothing more than a memory. Even now, when I think about that night, I don't remember the decorations or the music. I remember the shift, the exact second when a celebration turned into a warning, when joy was replaced by control. That moment became a marker in my life, dividing everything into before I spoke and after I spoke. What surprised me most was how calm everything became afterward. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no official summons, just quiet distance and unspoken rules. In a way, that calm was proof. If there truly had been a case, it would have moved forward. Instead, the threat dissolved once it stopped working. Fear was the fuel, and when I stopped feeding it, the fire died out. I learned that not all intimidation is loud. Sometimes it comes wrapped in politeness, concern, and phrases like, "for your own good." Sometimes it shows up at birthday parties, smiling while it reminds you of consequences. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to play along. The relationships that faded were never repaired, but I stopped seeing that as a loss. What disappeared wasn't love, it was access. Access to someone who could speak freely, who could be blamed, who could be controlled. When that access ended, so did the interest, and that told me everything I needed to know. I became more selective after that, about where I went, about who I celebrated with, about which rooms deserved my honesty. I realized that not every invitation is an honor, and not every family table is safe. Sometimes walking away is the only way to protect what matters. The birthday that ended in court threats didn't ruin my life, it clarified it. It stripped away the illusion of safety that silence keeps peace, that obedience earns respect, and that power always wears an obvious face. It taught me that truth doesn't need to be loud to be disruptive, it only needs to exist. If someone asked me now whether I would do it differently, I know the answer. I wouldn't change the sentence. I wouldn't soften the truth. I wouldn't apologize for reacting to disrespect just to keep the peace, because peace built on silence isn't peace at all. That night took away the illusion of safety, but it gave me something far more valuable: clarity about who I am when pressure shows up uninvited. And that clarity stayed with me long after the cake was gone, the lights were turned off, and the threat of court became nothing more than a memory.